Hi guys, Matt here. Just a quick content warning for this episode. We don't do these very often, but this episode contains themes of sexual violence or discussions of sexual crime, and then lengthy discussions about extreme body modification practices, which you may wish to not listen to or choose to listen to when you're feeling prepared. I hope you enjoy the episode.
So, Matt.
Yes.
Have you ever had the temptation to cut your genitals off?
Oh, we're not doing a content warning up top though. This is the content warning, is it?
Yes, this is the content warning.
Dear listeners, this episode contains discussion of pseudo-surgical procedures.
I'm not sure I'm even ready for this now.
Well, do you know what? The answer may surprise you. Anyway, let's move on with the podcast.
You're very welcome to Beneath Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. I am one of your hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I am joined as ever by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder. If you can hear any sounds in the background, it's because the tree surgeons decided to come up to arrive on the day. I have two recordings, so there might be mild chainsaw sounds in the background.
We're doing an episode about extreme body modification, and you're claiming that the quote-unquote chainsaw sounds are the quote-unquote tree surgeons. Is that right?
Yes.
Is that what you expect us to believe?
Yes, exactly. And they won't know any of the difference. I'm going to add in chainsaw sounds in post-production, all this sort of thing. But yet again, we are joined by a wonderful guest, a multi-hyphenate, who I think Matt is more qualified to introduce. Matt?
Well, yeah, you can sing, dance, and play the trombone. Is that right, Alice?
I used to play the flute, actually.
Oh, flute, that's what it was. No, Alice Snape, who is an incredible writer, journalist, editor-in-chief of Things and Ink, a magazine and latterly website about tattoo culture, author of several books on tattooing and tattoo culture. As I was just joking with her before we started recording, Mother and Baby's most prominent columnist, left under a cloud.
It's a very memorable part of my career. For someone who's never been pregnant or had a baby, I know an awful lot about pregnancy and birth, and wrote a lot at that period about good sex positions for when you're pregnant. That was a fun one.
That's the Instagram reel right there.
I have known Alice for a very, very long time, and I'm such a huge fan of her. So I apologise for joking around. I don't mean to belittle your career. You are an amazing curator. You've organised like some really amazing art exhibitions. You curated the 100 Hands for the exhibition that me and Derek and Stuart put on in Cornwall. You did an amazing curated exhibition of like painted cycle helmets for charity. You did one of little Cupid dolls. Like, you've just been this amazing kind of like organizational and curatorial figure within the tattoo industry for a long time. And you've moved on to this really interesting recent part of your life as a journalist for. I mean, who have you written for? You've written for Cosmopolitan, is that right?
I spent a year working on the features desk at Cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
So I've written loads and loads for them, and obviously always trying to bring tattoo subjects into those kind of places. So one of the articles I actually did for them while I was on the features team was about the TattooMeToo movement.
Yeah.
And it really was incredible how many times that article got read and shared. And then the number of women who got in touch with me on the back of that article, like rethinking moments and from their past when they got tattooed and hadn't realised something terrible had happened to them.
Yeah. And that was the one of the ways you got into court reporting, right? Because it's what we're going to talk about today properly. But you attend. Maybe we should talk about this quickly. You did attend the trial, one of the trials that came out of the TattooMeToo movement, right?
I did. So as part of that research for the feature I wrote on the TattooMeToo movement, I spoke to a lot of survivors who had been sexually assaulted by tattoo artists. And obviously, I don't know if you two remember during, I think it was the first lockdown.
Yeah.
Was when the TattooMeToo movement really kicked off, with some big artists being named and big lists being compiled of tattoo artists who were predators and who to avoid. And obviously during that time, these names were being outed, but obviously none of these tattoo artists had been convicted criminally in a court of law. So it meant that anybody who had named the artists was then at risk of libel.
Because of British libel laws, yeah.
Yeah. So there was no proof that they'd done this. So one of the women I spoke to for my Cosmopolitan article was a woman called Nina Creswell, and she's absolutely incredible. And during the Me Too movement, she named a tattoo artist called Billy Hay, who, and sorry, it's quite difficult talking about it because it was such an intense period when all the names were coming out, and also because Billy Hay was someone who I knew. It was such a difficult thing to be confronted with the fact that these people that who have been in the industry, who you trust and have even I'd put him on a platform on Things and Ink, and like all of these names coming out, that it was just really difficult to be confronted with that. And anyway, so Nina named Billy Hay, and Billy Hay decided to sue Nina for defamation.
And this was something that happened 10 years prior, right? Like 2010?
Yeah. So Nina had a really awful experience. She was sexually assaulted. And then she went to the police, and the police basically dismissed what she was saying and basically said it was her word against his, and not going to lie to you, nothing will probably happen about this. You're young and you're silly and you were drunk, and basically it's
as the awful thing that people always say, it's he said, she said. Yeah, awful.
And obviously rape convictions in this country are ridiculously low. But obviously to be told by a police officer that you're basically wasting your time when you've been sexually assaulted by someone is absolutely insane. So as a young woman, she kind of just was like, okay, I need to put that experience behind me. No one believes me, so I will just get on with my life. But for years, she had this like niggling feeling in the back of her mind, because Billy, as an artist, was just getting bigger and bigger. And she was like, I don't want someone to be put in the position I was. And I feel like I have a duty morally to warn other women in case something happens to them. So she wrote an account of what happened to her that night back in 2020, when she felt emboldened by other people naming names, and she thought, okay, I've been thinking about this for the past 10 years. Now's the time to do it, as part of this cacophony of other women's voices. What Nina did, she'd written this big account of what happened to her that night and decided to share it in a WhatsApp group of other survivors who were sharing their stories in a safe space. But her trust in that moment was broken because someone from that group shared the post about Billy with Billy or one of his mates. And he decided that because of that, he would sue her, and sued her for a lot of money.
Yeah, libel is like, I mean, people have threatened to sue me for libel for various things. Never actually gone through with it, but it is the amounts of money involved are they start in the six figures and go upwards. Like the point of threatening to sue somebody for libel is to either shut them up or financially ruin them, right?
Yeah. And he said that he'd had a serious loss of earnings since he'd been named. So the case went all the way to the Royal Courts of Justice. There was a week-long trial in front of a judge, and I decided I needed to be there because I didn't want it to happen without other people knowing. I wanted, and Nina, because of everything she'd been through, decided that she would find it difficult to be there in person. So she watched it all from her lawyer's office online. And I thought, if Nina isn't in that room, I would like to be in that room to represent all the survivors who've shared their stories with me. Otherwise, I don't think there would have been anyone else in there. And I wanted there to be someone there also who knows about the tattoo community.
Yeah. And this was 2023, right? Like it took a couple of years to get to this.
Yeah, it
that
took
point.
a long time, and Nina, during that time, for a while, she was representing herself. So trying to scrabble through it all, like, what the hell do I do? What argument have I got? Like, how can I get through this? And she ended up being put in touch with the Good Law Project, who wanted to help her for free because it was going to be like a really groundbreaking case, because they wanted to argue on the defense of truth and what was the other one? Truth and
public interest, right?
Public interest, that's it. And she won on both grounds in the end.
Yeah.
The judge ruled on the balance of probabilities, it was more like than not that he violently sexually assaulted her.
Yeah,
so,
the reporting on it says the judge found the allegation that she'd been sexually assaulted was, quote, substantially true, which is a remarkable thing in a civil trial and quite unprecedented in this country. The kind of thing that happens in the US a lot more, but was quite a remarkable, as you said, like precedent-setting clarification of the Defamation Act.
It was absolutely incredible. One of the most powerful days of that trial for me was when Nina, she was giving evidence from behind a screen in the courtroom, reliving obviously that moment 10 years ago from her life. And after she'd finished giving her testimony, she stood up and her head was literally just visible over the top of this screen. And I looked at her and I've never seen such like a haunted look in someone's eyes. And because it was just her head showing, she kind of looked like, you know, tattoo artist Fidget does all the drowning girls tattoos. Her head just looked like one of the drowning girls. And obviously that's become a really powerful tattoo symbol of survivors.
Fidget became a real advocate, didn't she, for the TattooMeToo movement, and just share it. I've been tattooed by her. She's an incredible artist. Yeah.
I've got a drowning girl, obviously. But Fidget has become she was such a big part of the Me Too movement. She really put herself on the line because she was one of the main artists who was sharing names.
Yeah.
And she's a big supporter of Nina as well. And I know after the trial, Nina went to get one of Fidget's drowning girls tattooed, which I think was a really powerful way to mark the end of her journey.
Yeah, really incredible. And you know, it was, as you said, it's interesting about the sort of tattoo community angle of it, because as you said, like, because you'd been involved in these curatorial and editorial projects, you sort of knew. I mean, we won't name any other names because we can't. But there were other people who were accused, who you'd, as you said, given platforms to, curated things of, and been friends with.
Yeah, it was really, really difficult when all of these names came out, and it's hard to not feel like you've been a part in helping to platform them, and then having to go back and review like who you've interviewed and who you've platformed and remove content and remove artwork. There was some really difficult conversations around that time. It was it was a really eye-opening time. And since then, I the way I would screen people I interview or speak to is very different.
Yeah.
But I think it's really hard in the tattoo. Like I've been part of the tattoo world for, well, almost a couple of decades now. But back at the beginning, I felt like you couldn't really like question those big names. Like they'd be like, well, who are you? Like,
yeah. Yeah, like there was, I mean, the power dynamics that often perpetuate these kinds of systemic and culturally normative abuses are empowered by power dynamics, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. Like when I first launched Things and Ink, which obviously was a tattoo magazine for women, platforming women's voices, both collectors and artists. I remember having a stand at one of the tattoo conventions and a load of male artists going, well, what are you doing here? We don't need a tattoo magazine for women. And it was some of those names, obviously, that ended up being outed. And I'm like, oh, there's a reason why you didn't want me there uncovering all of your awful behavior.
Yeah.
And finally giving women a voice to feel comfortable sharing what's happened to them. It feels like really sad that lots of women go because they feel like they want to be empowered by getting tattooed. And then they've not put themselves in a vulnerable position, but a male tattoo artist has taken advantage of someone in a vulnerable situation, because tattooing is it is such a vulnerable position to be in that you don't really know when you first start getting tattooed what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah. My partner had a very, very awful first tattoo experience that put her off for a very long time because of that kind of circumstance. And lots of really talented women and non-binary people who've been pushed out of tattooing. We did an episode about Kate Bird Cellegren now, who was one of the most talented tattoo artists of the early 21st century, and they described very clearly that it was those attitudes and those threats and those experiences that drove them out of the profession. And it's a huge part of that.
I had a very, very long conversation with them during the Me Too movement, because Kate's voice was like massive during that time. It's really, I think things are very, very different now. But there are still little pockets where the Me Too movement hasn't reached. There's still a lot to be done. Even I still work on Things and Ink. It's still a platform for women's voices. It's not really a magazine anymore. It's more just online. But Rosie, who I work with, literally this morning sent me a screenshot of a tattoo artist who'd posted a meme. I'm just going to look what it actually said. Oh, get your hands tattooed. It'll look pretty around her throat.
Yeah, that is unfortunately shit that I have seen replicated online and posted by men a lot in the past 2 years. It's really fucking grim whenever I see it.
I couldn't believe it. I was like, wow, okay, there's people well, I guess we're in an era of Andrew Tate, so it's, all pretty depressing and upsetting. And
well, yeah, I mean, I was on the Tom's other podcast. I was talking. Oh, actually, no, it was on this show. Actually, we were talking about right wing tattooing, and I mentioned, and I will mention again, that my dear friend Alicia Cardenas was like murdered by a man who was a tattoo artist who was like jealous and misogynistic and wrote huge misogynistic screeds. So yeah, these attitudes are all kind of tied up together in a really awful and problematic set of ways. But it was, am I right, Alice, that it was while you were at the court for Nina's case that you first came across the other case we want to talk about today, the Eunuch Maker case?
Yeah, so covering the Lena's libel case really got me into the, court reporting, and I started going to the Old Bailey.
Was there not a lot of cause for court reporting when you worked for Elle or like or like yeah,
Cosmo.
Cosmo. Yeah, not a lot of court reporting there. No.
I always try and bring either ideas about crime or tattoos to the places that I'm or dogs now, because I have a dog, and my dog is the love of my life. But yeah, I'm so interested in how the law is so limited in so many ways.
Oh yeah, I'm doing a law degree for this exact reason, because I am also fascinated by that. And the more I'm only like 1 year into my part-time law degree, so I've done half of a year of law so far. But like, yeah, that doesn't get any better when you actually start studying the law.
No, I'm sure
maybe we'll get into. Yeah.
No, well, so there was that, and also, do you guys remember when a lot of feminists were hailing the end of the rough sex defence?
Yeah, so we can get into that, because that's a big part of my research project, and it's really linked to this.
Yeah,
thing.
really, really linked. And actually, that's what kind of got me down the rabbit hole of different cases where obviously, you know, this consent is not a defence, but when a lot of the journalists, obviously I work largely in women's magazines like Cosmo and all these places, so a lot of my stories obviously have a feminist women's rights element to them. So what year was it that everyone was talking about the end of the rough sex defence?
It's been going on since 2017-ish.
Yeah, but
the main case was a case called R.V. Broadhurst, which was in 2016. She died, and Natalie Connolly, who was murdered by John Broadhurst, she was murdered in December 2016, and then that was a big drive. Although, again, as we'll probably get into, the discussion's been going on for a bit longer than that. But it was the killing of Natalie Connolly by John Broadhurst in 2016 that really start. I think that's where the We Can't Consent to This, who are the big campaign group against it, came from.
Yeah, and they campaigned for a long time to end the rough sex defence. And so when everyone was celebrating, I think it was about 2020 or 2021, where there was like an extra clause or something added to the law, but actually,
that's the Domestic Abuse Act.
That's what I'm talking about.
Of 2021.
Which was hailed as the end of the rough sex defence. But what most of the campaigners didn't realise it was already enshrined in law that you can't consent to harm. So it should never have been used as a defence anyway.
And it wasn't, ironic. Well, okay, maybe we'll get into this. This is what I'm writing a book about, so this we could like buckle up. Maybe I don't know. So
that's what really got me into. I wrote an article for Vice at the time of when that domestic abuse bill was passed about why the BDSM community were particularly worried about it, about removing consent from the equation, because that's removing people's autonomy. And obviously using the rough sex defence in a murder case is very different to talking.
Because there'd been, I don't know, maybe I'll quickly lay this out for people who don't know this story. So, and we can like rewind in time, but basically, in the we are going to do, hopefully this year we'll do some more episodes specifically on the precursors to this. But the short version is that a series of court cases involving at least one of the participants of whom was a tattoo artist and body piercer called Mr. Sebastian, called Operation Spanner, resulted in a case called R.V. Brown that took place between 1987 and was legally concluded in 1997. So it went on for the best part of 20 years. But the outcome of all of those processes, which went right up to the Court of Human Rights, was that, to put it very, very bluntly, as you said, Alice, you cannot consent to serious harm, which is basically ABH, assault occasioning ABH, or assault or grievous bodily harm or wounding. So anything that like leaves a mark that is more than transient or trifling or breaks the skin, consent is no defense, other than in some really weird and quite in some senses, arbitrary exclusions. So, including dangerous exhibitions, so like sword swallowing and like tightrope walking and stuff. Religious flagellation, so you can whip people for Jesus but not for sex. Lawful chastisement, because beating your children was still okay in the 80s, so you're allowed to beat your children but not your wife or husband, and some others.
Matt, does that mean if you have a crucifix on the wall, it's okay? It's a real come to Jesus moment.
You're not allowed to enjoy it. I mean, again, this is going to be a long thing, and I said I've already written many hundreds of thousands of words on this, and we'll be writing a book on it. But the basic thing is that sexual pleasure is not a good reason for harm, right? So that was all basically codified, as you said, Alice, in the law in the UK, basically in 1994. But almost instantly, like, everyone was a bit embarrassed by it. There was another case shortly after those cases. Some of the participants went to prison, but not for very long. It did ruin all of the people involved's lives. But a couple of years later, there was a case in 1997 called R.V. Wilson. And in R.V. Wilson, rather than being a group of gay men having group sex, it was a straight couple, the female partner of which had a branding consensually. When she went to the doctor for something else, the doctor saw it. It was reported to the police. It went to court, and the judge in that case, Judge Eady, said, we don't want to get involved in what consenting adults get involved in behind closed doors. So it sort of went away. Even though it was technically the law, it wasn't actually enforced at all, or barely, for best part of 20 years. And I gave a talk in 2013, along with my friend Alex Dimmock, who's a criminologist at the University of Goldsmiths and a lawyer. And she was involved in that group you mentioned, Alice Backlash, the campaigning group for kinky people's rights, basically. And we were sort of saying, look, hey guys, this is actually still the law technically. Everyone's a bit embarrassed by it, but it may well come back. And then a couple of years after that, 2016, which is sort of the background to this rough sex offence as well, the UK government brought in new laws meant to deal with online pornography. And one of the things that they drew the line at and said was illegal was anything that was basically would technically constitute a withdrawal of consent, or the infliction of harm. So a couple of pornographers, including a feminist spanking website peddler called Pandora Blake, and another friend of mine who goes by the name of Mistress Tatiana, who's now got a PhD in sociology, were basically like told that they were making illegal pornography. They sued in 2016 and won. And again, that's a whole complicated story. People can look that up. We'll talk about it in another episode. But basically, that sort of brought the discussion back into the public thought process again in 2016. And then, as you mentioned, at the end of 2016, Natalie Connolly was murdered by her boyfriend, John Broadhurst. Basically, she died in really awful circumstances that I'm not going to describe. But basically, Broadhurst claimed that it was part of consensual sexual activity, which is what the jury found that it was basically completely ridiculous to claim. He tried to have this quote unquote rough sex offence, but as you pointed out, it was actually rejected. The court says you're not allowed to consent to harm. But this sort of brought it back into the minds of judges and of policymakers, and it was there because the case of and there was some other cases around the same time. One of a British woman who was murdered in Australia, whose murderer also made the same defence, but also wasn't allowed to do it. Her name was Grace Millane. So she died in 2019. In New Zealand, not in Australia. But yeah, like this sort of brought it back into everyone's mind. John Broadhurst, as for reasons will become interesting in a minute, got about 45 months in prison, 3.5 years for manslaughter. because it was the court accepted he didn't intend to murder her, but nevertheless, you don't need intent to actually kill. You just need intent to cause GBH in order to be convicted. So anyway, he was convicted of manslaughter, but he got 46 or so months in prison. In 2018, someone else involved in the tattoo scene that maybe you know, Alice, Brendan McCarthy, was arrested for doing body modification on customers and friends of his. And again, we'll do a whole episode about this when we talk about it more, but there was that his arrest set off a chain where his lawyers at every stage went, because all of the people that are quote unquote victims of this consented, and every stage of the law they went, it doesn't matter, you haven't got a defense. So he had to plead guilty, and he went to prison. Bear in mind, Broadhurst went to prison for about 45 months. Brendan went to prison for 40 months, almost the same amount of time for consensual body mod with no injury, you know, in terms of like, you know, nothing went wrong.
Yeah, it's crazy. That was the comparison I made in my article for Vice. Like, how is there any sense that they could have had basically the same prison sentence? It just doesn't.
It's astonishing. The RV Brown, the 90s case, and RVBM Brendan's case are now like day one law school about laws on assault and consent, which was a fun lesson to sit in because I knew a lot more about the case than my friend who was taking the class. But this is absolutely now pivotal, central to British law. And as you said, there was huge discussions. There was also parallel discussions around this time when Theresa May was Home Secretary about quote unquote designer vaginas and vaginoplasty and whether that was legal or not. There's been a case recently of a Birmingham plastic surgeon who was basically sort of doing breast implantations on people without really properly getting consent and tried to claim this. And anyway, to try and kind of deal with this epidemic of domestic violence, and particularly the fact that domestic violence victims often are unwilling to testify, the Home Secretary at the time, a cross-party set of advocates, including Jess Phillips and Harriet Harman, basically said this will be a really useful tool because then we can, if people are injured or harmed physically in the course of domestic violence, we don't need them to testify because the fact that they have been harmed is sufficient, right? So Harriet Harman directly said, we've got this really useful piece of case law from the 90s that comes out of a really strange, homophobic and illiberal place, but using it for very well-meaning ends. And yeah, so that's the background. Like there was another body modifier in Australia called Brendan Tarrant, who was more justifiably, in my opinion, than Brendan, caught up in this as well. Anyway, so this whole principle about like you can consent to a like you can ask someone to slap you, for example, and you can also, interestingly enough, you can consent to what's called rough and undisciplined horseplay. So some firefighters were charged because they set fire to one of their mates and he got really badly injured, and they got yeah.
I'm gonna do that to you next time, Matt.
These are the things that one learns in law school. So you can do that, but if it's but sexual reasons and body modification other than tattooing, probably scarification, although it's not exactly clear, but scarification is probably okay. There are limits to that. So this case that we'll finally get onto in a second happens in this moment when everyone is thinking about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, basically, it's funny. There was an article published in the Times, I think, initially, like the first reports about this case, which became known as like the Nullo case. We'll explain what that means in a second, or the Eunuch Maker case. Like, basically came up in I think 2019, maybe a little bit later. I can't remember the exact date that the arrests happened initially, but I saw the sort of like story that was published in the Times about it, and I posted on Twitter at the time, like, basically the story was like people had been arrested initially for running a website called Eunuch Maker on the dark web, which shared images.
It wasn't even on the dark web, Matt.
It was on the well, there was dark Wikipedia, but on the open web, I guess, as well. Yeah. Thank you. Basically, which was selling videos which reported to be of voluntary self-demand castration. And I posted on Twitter, because this is a movement which, again, I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, like had been a big part. And we talked a bit about it. If listeners want to go back and listen to our discussion with Sean Porter that we did last year or before, whenever it was. We talked about this
specifically on the Patreon
only. That was part of the body modification scene in the early 2000s of like men or people with penises who willingly wanted them to be removed and did so basically in the privacy of their own homes without official medical supervision. But a huge part of that subculture was like fantasy as well, right? So there were many more people who were fetishistically interested in it and actually even pretending to do it than actually went through with it. And so I basically posted on Twitter, like, I'd be interested to see what happens with this case, but I think it's anyone who's selling videos of this in 2018, 19 is probably it's probably not real. And I got a DM from someone who basically said, of course it's real. And then something else, and then basically blocked me immediately. And I was like, oh, okay.
Oh my God.
Weird. So, and then I was really expecting, because I'm like, I'm probably am the only academic in the UK who knows anything about this, really. There are probably some other people as well on the legal side, but certainly from a kind of cultural side, I'm probably the only person who knows. But I thought, I'm going to get loads of calls. And then it sort of wasn't really reported on and didn't become a huge thing. And of course, it has had a little bit of coverage, but in an earlier era, in the Operation Spanner era, right, when these guys were arrested in the 80s for really doing nothing other than really sort of a bit of body piercing and hot wax and stuff, it was on the front page for months. They put everyone's names and addresses on the front page of the papers. There was like huge amounts of satanic panic headlines. And I was like, this, and then this case barely got mentioned. So when you messaged me and said I'm at the courtroom, I was just so interested that you were there.
Obviously, when I found myself at the Old Bailey and I knew it was going to be the sentencing, obviously, like you mentioned before, these guys couldn't have a trial because they couldn't.
They pled guilty. Yeah. They pled guilty. They had no defense. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it took a long time for some of them to plead guilty because they'd wanted to go down a consent route, but obviously couldn't, so pled guilty. And I was like, I really wanted to be at the sentencing. There was some of the men who were part of the Eunuch Maker group had varying involvement in it and were sentenced at different times.
Yeah,
but I was there. Yeah, I was there for all the different sentences.
So tell us about the case then. I've sort of given the background a bit. Like, what actually are the facts? Like, what what happened? What do we know?
So at the centre of the case is a guy called Marius Gustafsson who, basically, since he was very young, has always felt this want to remove parts of his body. And when he moved over from Denmark, I think.
Norway, I think.
Norway, that's it. When he moved over to London from Norway, he started falling into a crowd of more open-minded people and was like, yeah, I still really have this urge to cut off my penis. And I've met more people who also want to cut off their penis. Maybe we can help each other. And well, I guess you know what it's like when you meet one person who wants something, you fall into groups, don't you? And you find other people with the same interests. So it's the same as anything. So
Tom and I talked on to Sean, and I've talked a lot about this in loads of other contexts. Like, it's really difficult, and probably impossible to properly unpick like the relationship between desire and cause. Like if you hadn't have ever seen someone else doing it, would you have done it? Does that even matter? Like, what are the moral? Like, I think it's a really interesting, complicated question about moral contagion and about information sharing, and
also as well like the massive gulf between like desire and actualization as well. Like the movement from simply a sexual or otherwise desire into the actualization of the act.
Yeah, and then also being part of a group that normalizes this, so it feels like it's okay, which I suppose is both good and bad, right? But he met a lot of and he is a gay guy, and some of the people, other men involved in this case were quite young. I think that was one of the things the judges highlighted as being particularly problematic.
That was a similar thing in with Operation Spanner as well. There were a couple of people who were in their late teens, so above the age of sexual consent for straight people at the time, but not above the age of sexual consent for gay couples, and much younger than several of the people involved. So there, that problematic and complicated age dynamic as well.
Yeah, and I think that so as part of the sentencing, Brendan McCarthy's case, who you mentioned before, was referenced multiple times as like one of the defining cases that you can't consent to GBH, and
I think also because Brendan's case clarified that body modification wasn't in that acceptable category, because the Spanner case was about sex, really. Although as I said, one of the people involved was a body piercer and tattooer, but it was really about sexual pleasure. The BM case was about body modification, and the court argued. I mean, I really tried to get involved in that case. I did actually end up submitting post-sentencing mitigation or at the request of his lawyers, but I wasn't involved in it before then, despite trying very hard to be so, because I think I could have made at least some case that some of the things that he did were within a kind of ambit of stuff that was acceptable. But like, the argument was like, it's not up to the courts, and I think it's fair enough in a way, it's not up to the courts to try and demarcate new categories of acceptable violence. If Parliament wants to make these things legal, they can make a law about it, but we're not gonna say this is okay. And in some senses, like, I feel very, I don't know how you feel about this, Tom or Alice as well. Like, I feel very conflicted about it, because on the one hand, like, I don't want people to be sent to prison for consensual acts done with full knowledge. But on the other hand, I also don't want like street shops where anyone can walk in and pay money and get their tongue split or get their dick cut off. And I don't. It's one of the issues. And my PhD student Alexandra Grolimond, who I should mention here as well, has been working on a legal PhD around these issues, and I'm trying to write a book on the cultural issues and histories of them. Is that actually one of the reasons, and they keep trying to fix this in law. They keep trying to fix it. They've been trying to fix it for over 20 years to try and rewrite the law to make it clearer and make it more fair and more just. But basically, you cannot textually and in terms of policy adequately write a list of things that are okay and a list of things that are not okay. That when it came to another bit of law which comes in here sometimes, which is the Female Genital Mutilation Act of 2003, with that act, thanks to the campaigning of the British Association of Professional Piercers, the CPS went, we cannot fix the law and make the stuff we want to make illegal, and like consensual piercing on adult women legal. So we're just going to not charge people. It's in the charging guidance, not in the law. And I don't know how you feel about that, because you were in court, and did you see, you sort of felt the atmosphere, you got a sense of what the vibe was?
It was so interesting. So imagine, like, I'll set the scene. Like, we're in one of the courtrooms at the Old Bailey, and for anyone who hasn't been there before, there is a public gallery in the Old Bailey, and there is also, in the well of the court, there's a dedicated press bench where all of the journalists sit. And so I'm sitting in the press bench with all the other members of the press, like the Daily Mail, and there was also some Norwegian journalists who had been following the case because he was from Norway, and it wasn't like packed. It was busy. It's one of the it was one of the more popular cases, I would say. But what I was shocked at was the disgust, the absolute disgust of the other journalists. Like, these are like hardened court reporters who cover rape and murder and all of these violent crimes where there has been absolutely no consent at all. And all of these journalists thought that this Eunuch Maker case was the most grotesque thing they'd ever heard. They couldn't believe how disgusting it was. They couldn't get their head around it. They just couldn't understand why anyone in their right mind would want their penis or their balls chopped off.
Or their leg, in Gustafsson's case.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe that reaction from the journalists says more about, I think, people's general feeling towards like bodily integrity, that like in the case of those murders or rape cases, they can somewhat make sense of it, but someone being willing to do it to themselves doesn't make sense to them?
Yeah, they just can't wrap their brain around that. And what I find, particularly in courts of law with journalists and judges and people who, I think there's also like very black and white way of viewing things, and also people who can't step out of their own experience.
Yeah.
So just because they don't want that, they can't even comprehend that anyone else would want that.
And if you go back and read, and this is, as I said, sometimes the only things that British law students read about consent in the law is read the Spanner judgment. And this is in the 80s, and it's full of that as well. It's full of that disgust and horror and confusion and kind of viscerality. I mean, as I said, in that case, the actual practices were nowhere near as kind of invasive or as permanently life-altering as some of the things that Gustafsson and his co-defendants were accused of and convicted of. But like, all those problems that you point out, Alice, are actually huge problems in the law more generally. And this lack of empathy, I think, is really interesting because, the other thing that's really interesting about this, right, is that in principle, right, we charge people by what they intend to do, not by what they actually did, right? So the classic example in law is like drink driving. If you drink, drive and kill somebody, you don't get charged with manslaughter. In fact, there's a whole separate law called death by dangerous driving, because like you intended to get in a car and drink drive, you didn't intend to murder someone. And if you punch someone and they die, you're not going to, you didn't mean to kill them or seriously injure them, you're not going to get charged with murder. However, what's really interesting about these cases about body modification is that sometimes, and I think certainly in the reporting, if not always the legal logic, that kind of principle gets thrown out the window. And we're much more concerned about the end point than the beginning point. Although, that's a complicated legal point that
I think,
a bit nerdy, but
I think, Matt, this case, and I think similar cases that I suppose transgress ideas of bodily integrity, they not only represent like a transgression of the law, but also a kind of a moral injury to the public. That this sort of like, because murder happens all the time, all of these crimes that I suppose journalists don't really react to, they have some sort of logical framework in their mind of what drives people to it. But something like the Eunuch Maker case, both for the law, the public, and the journalists, it's almost kind of not, the grotesqueness is nonsensical and the drive to do it is completely ununderstandable. So like the reporting and the sentencing also represents a kind of like moral injury to the public and a lesson, as much as it is you have broken the law.
Yeah. And there was certain, like, in the judge's remarks from the Eunuch Maker case, he literally rejected that some of the men said that this was not sexually motivated. This was about gender. It was about it was their wants aren't covered for under like, you can't, they're not trans, but their bodies don't represent who they are. So they wanted to get rid of their penis to match their gender identity, but you can't just
do that.
This country, you can't just go to your GP and be like, I want my penis cut.
It's not actually a recognised psychiatric disorder in the DSM, but the diagnostic criteria which are drawn up are for a condition that gets called apotemnophilia, or bodily integrity disorder. And ironically, and probably one of the reasons it hasn't been fully codified, is that one of the people that wrote the diagnostic criteria was a psychiatrist who himself was, afflicted by this. But interestingly enough, as far as the few case reports that we have over the course of the last 30 years, if you do have a recognized, if it does seem you meet the diagnostic criteria for BID, doing that removal solves the problem in the same way that people who medically transition, it helps them psychologically. However, it's even more complicated for BID to figure out if someone's just kind of, self-injuring by proxy, if it is a kind of more transient condition. But it seems, as I said, from the sparse literature there is, was supposed to be starting to written at the end of the 90s, when the first wave of this stuff was starting to become visible to the world in the early 2000s and as well. It was basically like people were shooting their own legs off, putting their feet on train tracks, putting their hands into circular saws. But that was it. They didn't then go on to keep, in most cases, keep removing other body parts. It wasn't like a kind of addiction or a self-harming process. It was, as you said, it was a kind of desire to reconcile your internal sense of bodily size with your proprioceptive sense, if you like, with your actual body.
Yeah, and this is what Gustafsson, the main guy, the head, the Eunuch Maker, he had, as part of his mitigation in the case, had said about having BID, but the judge rejected it because obviously there was no proof. But his barrister tried to argue the fact that he'd had this want from when he was a child, and just because it's not been medically proven, like why has he felt that ways, and why has he gone on to act that out? So I guess it's probably interesting now to think about the cast of characters. Well, I'll call them like the people, because we've got Gustafsson at the top, who's the one who ran the website and sort of recruited people to help him. So he would remove some of the penises himself. He removed his own penis too.
And he was a nurse, right? So he'd also was he not the nurse?
No, he was not the nurse. There was a nurse who got involved at a later point. There was also another guy who worked in a hospital, so had access to like medical equipment and stuff. There was some of the guys involved, like they're really intelligent people. It's not just, I think that's what other, like some of the journalists also find, like it's a respectable group of men who have had professional jobs. It's not, we're not talking about like your average criminal.
Same with Operation Spanner. There was a missile engineer and a school teacher and in fact, weirdly, although there was a crossover in the BME era between like this subculture and the broader tattoo and body mod scene, it was only really a very light crossover. And most of these people, I was sort of expecting that I might have known, or at least known of, some of these people involved. And because I've been around this stuff for a long time, I didn't. And none of these people are visibly like, they're not crazy looking tattooed people.
Oh, just one was actually.
One was.
There was one, because I was quite surprised as well. In the lineup of the men who were in the dock, there was only one who was heavily tattooed and looked like someone who you might see at a tattoo convention. Other than that, there wasn't really many tattoos going on.
Alice, I want to ask as well, like, how did, I suppose, the factor of like the streaming site and the commercial aspect of it factor into the sentencing?
Oh yeah, that's what made it way worse. Was the filming and the selling of it. And actually, without that, I think it would have been really hard for them to bring a conviction. That's what was all. It was all of the videos that were used as evidence, and the fact.
Oh, in terms of the evidence, yeah,
in terms of the evidence, and also profiting off it, like that made it all a lot worse.
And again, exactly what happened in Spanner. Like a huge motivating feature of Operation Spanner was the fact that they were found located because of videotapes. Videotapes were used as evidence in court, and then a huge part of the moral panic in the late 80s was about like, what if children see these videos, you know, home recording, and to have this parallel with the internet is super, super interesting. I mean, one of the news reports of the BBC during the trial is literally just like, male castration website made 300 grand, 22,000 subscribers. Like, the moral contagion part of this is really interesting.
I did feel sad for some of the guys who were promised money and then never got paid.
Always submit your invoices on time if you're a freelancer. You know, if you're doing gig work, whether it's, you know, freelance writing or cutting people's balls off, always get your invoices in on time. And if they're not paid within 90 days, you can take them to small claims court. But yeah, it's something that I kind of found fascinating with it is like a lot of the coverage, it kind of like flew under the radar.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it was reported, but it wasn't. It was never like top main big news.
I think obviously because I'm a journalist, I work in magazines, and I was pitching the story around to different places, and people were not receptive. People were very, very scared of it, particularly if you wanted to maybe spin a different angle on it and talk about the consent and talk about these men in, you know, their backstories, like as rounded characters, as people who have autonomy, of people who wanted to do these things to themselves, and no one wanted to have that conversation. So yeah, like I'm not surprised that not many people, I'm sure there's people who've never even heard of this story.
Yeah.
I've mentioned it in conversation with people who I assume would know about it, and they're like, what the hell are you talking about?
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
But do you think maybe obviously the commerce element of it leaned into the sentencing, and Matt, you mentioned the moral contagion. Do you think the sentencing is also like an attempt to contain a kind of moral contagion, but also like the spread of the idea that this is possible?
Yeah, I only know because Gustafsson got like 22 years, which is basically a life, pretty much equivalent to a life sentence, which is astonishing. Like, you literally can get less for murder if you've got mitigating factors for your murder. I mean, he wasn't just convicted of the harm. He was convicted of having some videos of underage people, and also of trading in body parts, which is also a whole nother, we should probably do an episode about that. Like, that's also not legal. You can't buy and sell body parts, guys. But yeah, 22 years. What did the others get?
So there was a mix of, like, there was quite a vast, most of them except one got a suspended sentence, but for the rest of them there was anything from like a couple of years up to about 11 or 12 years, depending on how involved they were. One sentence that I was really shocked at, there was one of the younger guys called Jacob Crimby Appleby. He was just a teenager at the time he got involved, and he'd met Gustafsson online and they were having a sexual relationship. But at the time, he was obviously just a young boy exploring his identity and kind of got involved with them. He actually never had anything done to himself, but there was a sense that, you know, he really like idolized Gustafsson. And so the reason why he ended up going to prison was so Gustafsson decided to freeze his leg. So he put his leg in ice for about a day, 6 hours or something. And Jacob, this young guy, was there while Gustafsson had his leg on ice, and put some ice on his leg. And that was his involvement in the case.
Yeah. Aiding and abetting.
Yeah. And he was on a video of him putting ice on Gustafsson's leg, and yeah, I think he got a 4-year sentence for that. Yeah. I was really shocked.
That is astonishing, especially because he was also mentioned sort of in the reporting as, like, you know, being groomed or being the victim of Gustafsson's.
And I just feel like, so he got sentenced separately. Him and two other of the guys were got sentenced before Gustafsson, and I think there was like 9 others got sentenced. That happened before. And I was sitting outside the courtroom, and he was sitting opposite me, and he was just like, in his suit. He looked like he was about to go in and do his GCSEs or something. Like, he looked so young and vulnerable, and he was just sitting there playing on his phone. Got called into court. and then sentenced to 4 years in prison. And just to see that happen, you know, when you're in court and like you can feel the gravity of that, like that one decision he's made at that point in his life, and he'd been bullied and groomed in a sense by Gustafsson, and then to watch him walk in that courtroom and have all these things played out like in court and then be remanded into prison. I found it really difficult to watch.
Did he actually, he didn't even get a suspended sentence, he actually went to prison?
No, he went to prison.
Wow.
He went to prison. He wasn't the one who got the suspended sentence. And then during so that was 3 of them got sentenced on that day. And then it was a few weeks later that there was the main sentencing for Gustafsson and the rest of
5
men
others,
involved. Right. And it was a 2-day sentencing hearing. So each of the barristers would go through all of the mitigating circumstances. The prosecuting barristers obviously put forward their case as to why these defendants should get the highest sentence possible. And seeing all the men sitting in the dock together, you could, interestingly though, Gustafsson wasn't there in person. So because now he's lost his leg, there is actually no disabled access to get into the dock.
Oh my God, no.
So he couldn't be there in person because they cannot have anybody any defendant who's in a wheelchair cannot physically be in the Old Bailey.
That is incredible. I did not know that. That is incredible.
That is insane. So he's on a video link from the prison, and the rest of the men in this glass-fronted dock in one of the bigger courtrooms, because there's about 10 of them all sitting side by side. But what I found, like, these men are obviously friends, and they're, you know, I felt like
did they all know each other?
Some of them did. There was 3 of them who were clearly very good friends because they were comforting each other. And so some of the defendants were on bail and some were remanded. But on the first day of the sentencing hearing, they were all remanded into custody. Which is also a really, really hard thing to witness as someone who's a bystander in the courtroom, because these are men who have obviously been charged of this crime and they've been on bail for a couple of years, and they don't know until that point that they're going to get remanded into custody. And the judge said, this doesn't mean that it's no indication of what your sentence is going to be, but you are being remanded into custody tonight and you're going to be brought back tomorrow. Watching that happen, I saw 2 of the men just literally broke down, and I feel like I'm like an extreme empath. So their sadness it really upset me to see that, because I could see these weren't bad people. And I remember at that point, I remember smiling at one of the guys because he was like rubbing his back as one of the guys was crying. And I smiled I felt like I wanted them to know that I wasn't one of those awful journalists who was going to be like, look at this case. So I smiled at him and he smiled back. And then I remember coming out of the courtroom and one of the journalists go, "Oh my God, are you okay?" He smiled at you. I was like, yes. These are people. You do know these are people.
I mean, the approach I'm taking in my book about the Spanner case is to actually try and reinsert the humanity as much as possible into those narratives, because the RV Brown and RVBM have become just like rules that take up half a page in a law textbook. But you can read, for example, Colin Lasky's testimony. He gave testimony to the Runciman Commission, which was a commission in the early 90s about what the criminal law had been up to in Britain, and he was one of the people sort of who gave evidence of how badly he felt he'd been treated. And there's also a little bit of video of the Spanner defendants in the late 90s when they're about to go to the European Court of Human Rights, and they're so hopeful that it's all going to be okay because the liberal European Court is going to sort of overturn the awful tail end of the Tory government and actually government's illiberalism towards them. And of course, like what happens is the Strasbourg court rule unanimously against them. And it's so heartbreaking to watch that video because you know what's coming next as a historian. And reading Colin Lasky's testimony where he talks about, being arrested for something that really everyone involved enjoyed. Again, the parallels aren't exact between that and the Gustafsson case, but the principles are the same. And similarly, there are letters from Mr. Sebastian, who and I know from people who have spoken to Brendan McCarthy as well that he felt the same. Like, it's just unbelievable because you're like, we didn't actually like do anything wrong, right? Like, okay, things could have gone badly, like people could have died, it was dangerous, reckless, probably stupid. I don't want to encourage or condone it. I understand where it comes from, but I don't want to say that I think it's entirely unjust that they were sentenced to some kind of punishment. But at the same time, as you said, these are human beings, and it gets to give people who were doing something at one level kind and curious, even if stupid and reckless. Like, it seems so strange to give those people the same sentences as like people who actually like desire to murder other human beings, and as you said, who certainly more than people who commit violent rapes, violent robberies, huge amounts of financial crime. Like, it's really, really amazing how these, as you said, this gets dehumanized. And it's astonishing to hear that. I mean, it's sort of telling that other journalists are clearly participating in that, even when they're in the room.
Yeah, it was crazy to be part of. And also, what was mentioned multiple times was that lots of the victims were treated as victims, but they categorically didn't want to be victims, and they didn't want this case to be brought to court.
When McCarthy was charged with a very small selection of things, they sort of cherry picked. I mean, necessarily, I suppose, cherry picked the things that they actually brought to charge him with. And one of the people, which was one of his best friends, and absolutely fully is furious that he was like the poster boy victim for sending a good friend of his to prison.
None of that makes any sense. It doesn't make sense.
No. And maybe it's interesting. I mean, what was it? As I said, what was interesting after Spanner, there was discussions about, and actually the Law Commission did suggest that the law be changed because it was realised by certainly kind of the libertarian part of British civil society, like Liberty in particular, that gay rights organisations completely pushed them under the bus, but because it wasn't the story that mainstream gay organisations wanted to tell about gay life in the 90s. But civil liberties organisations, including Liberty, were very angry about this. And actually, the Law Commission tries to change the law, but of course, the Blair government came in 97 and basically, hey, we're going to make it easier for people to like stick rose thorns in each other's dicks, was not a big priority of the Blair government. And so everyone just sort of got embarrassed by it. And I wonder, like, it was interesting to me, this case, because, as you said, there was this huge energy around the consent context. And this is before the law comes in, to be fair, the addition to the Domestic Abuse Act, and it's not, exactly parallel. But I wonder if part of the reason it wasn't super reported, apart from the kind of viscerality of it, is that it is as you said, it's interesting that no one wanted to have that difficult conversation about it, because it shows up the real, I mean, literally intractable, unsolvable problems between things that we as a society want to prohibit, which is, even if people say they consent to certain things, probably we shouldn't be encouraging it. But on the same time, how do we draw a line between that and putting people in prison for things that really aren't harming anyone in any, for certain definitions of harm? It's really difficult. But I don't know if you agree with that, like, Alice. Do you think that one of the reasons that there wasn't a big, huge, we haven't had a big Netflix documentary about this, we haven't talked about it, is it's just too complicated to talk about?
Yeah, probably. There has been one documentary about it.
Yeah,
two-parter on Crime Channel.
But was it actually on telly, that doc? Was it just online?
No, I think it's on Amazon Prime.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It's actually pretty balanced. I think it's a Sky documentary, actually.
Oh, is it? Okay. Good.
So there is a 2-parter, like 2-hour longs, and Brendan McCarthy is on it.
Yeah. Oh, I should. What I didn't know that. That's really interesting. I sort of assumed that it was just a kind of random online thing. I haven't actually watched it.
No,
So
it's
that's
really
interesting.
It's not badly done actually, and he
that came out not that long ago, right? Like earlier this year.
Very recently.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, and it sort of got out of my mind. So that's really interesting.
I would say it's a really good one to watch about the case. Actually, it's the most balanced thing I've seen about it, and talks to a range of different people involved in it, both involved in the case and some of the victims. But I think one of the interesting things that come up in this, I feel like there is also, like, one of the victims talks about actually being really pleased with everything that's happened, but feels like he wasn't in a position to consent. He went back for multiple procedures. So I think, obviously, because I guess what comes up in all of this is people's capacity to consent, and where you draw the line with that. Because I think one of the things that the judge said, one of the comments he said was like, he didn't believe that any of the victims could be in a capacity to consent, because why would you even want to consent? Which I thought was interesting. He obviously didn't think any of the victims were in their right mind because
the very fact that they went through with it meant that they couldn't have been.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of really interesting and complicated legal theorization about this issue, even as applied to more straightforward issues of sexual consent. That, you know, there are strands of feminist academic theory who think that consent is sort of not quite the right model to think about these issues, because, as you said, it can be vitiated. It seems not to fully account for what we really mean.
Yeah,
it's complicated.
And also, like, thinking about, you can consent in the moment, and then what is the difference then when you maybe regret giving that consent, or whether you couldn't have given the consent? Like, where does that line draw? Because you can fully consent to something in the moment, and then the aftermath of that be like, oh, why the fuck did I do that? But that doesn't mean that your consent was invalid. But looking back, maybe you're like, I don't know why I did. It's so complicated.
Yeah,
it's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's literally something that the best minds of the legal profession have been trying to fix. I mean, really, probably since the 80s. I haven't really mentioned this, but the law that underpins this is from the 1860s. So it's a 150-year-old law, and people haven't been solved it for a long time. No. So anyway, we're not going to solve it in our podcast, especially as we're running out of time. But I think, like, it's such an interesting and complicated case, and it's amazing that you got to kind of be there as a witness to the courtroom events.
I will never forget that experiences. I'm glad I was there I believed a rational voice, even though they probably all thought I was, like, absolutely mental. But I'm glad I was there to see it and to see how those kind of cases are argued, because I actually thought that some of the defense barristers, had really interesting lines of argument that were just completely thrown out. Like, one of them talked about, obviously, being gay used to be illegal. Also talked about the current debates we're also having about assisted dying and where consent's involved in that. And he drew some really interesting parallels about what we can and can't consent to. And he believed that this is something that we just don't have the capacity to argue in the law, but actually maybe in the future we'll have very different views around what we can and can't do with our body.
Yeah.
So he seemed like he was quite progressive.
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly why I'm trying to put some of this into historical context, because this is the stuff that gets completely missed. And if people are outside of these communities, they start from, in my view, the wrong starting point. But I think we could definitely, I mean, as I said, we are going to do, the other thing I'm trying to do at the moment is make a TV show about Operation Spanner and its legacies. And so we're waiting to see what happens with that before we embark on our podcast series about this. But we will be doing more about this later this year. So we'd love to have you back. Love to have you back on again, Alice.
I'm always up for it. That was really fun.
Where can people find you online, Alice?
I mean, I'm on Instagram, Alice Snape, Alice C Snape, but I don't really post on there that much these days. I've still got the Things in Ink Instagram account.
And you've got th-ink.co.uk, the Things in Ink.
And I still write for a lot of the big publications, so my name might lurk around on Cosmo, or I've just written a big piece for Metro.
Keep an eye out peeled on Mother and Baby.
I don't do Mother and Baby.
You could be back, but Alice, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a fascinating episode, and I'm going to have a lot of fun editing it. But also, as well, in addition to thanking you, we have some other people to thank. If you're hearing this, you are on the Patreon. So a shout out to our £10 above patrons: Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Ferris Mueller's Day Off, Shit Jesus, Seb Lewis, Rowe, Reed Ford, and Kirsten Wright, Kevin Fish, Kathleen Burkhardt, James Schick, Eva, E-Dub, Dylan, Charlie Lightning, and Casey Wardell. Thank you to you all. As always, find us on Instagram at Beneath the Skin Pod. It's a thank you and goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me too.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.